You are what you eat, an age-old adage that's as true today as it's ever been. And not just because the food we eat literally is the basis of every cell in our bodies, but also because for the last million years, the food and diets that we've been able to achieve have literally allowed us to leave the caves, grow larger brains, and develop economies, cultures, and the societies that are around us today. But of course, if you needed any other reason to be convinced that we are what we eat, you only need to ask the nearest hipster. Because in 2017, once again, the most photographed foods on Instagram and social media, of course, is our food. So how is it that something so positive and so powerful has become such an enormous challenge? We've already heard a lot about it over the last 2 days. But dietary risks are now the single biggest risk for disability-adjusted life years across the planet. That's years of life lost, plus years of life lived with disability. Much of the planet is now living with a double burden of malnutrition. 1.9 billion adults worldwide are overweight or obese, 650 million of them are in fact obese, and 815 million and climbing continue to be hungry. This double burden can occur at the individual level with obesity and micronutrient deficiency. It could be stunting early in life, but as the environment around you changes with economic development, you're obese by adulthood. It could be the same household where you have a mother who is micronutrient deficient, anemic, or undernourished, but a child who is also stunted, and a grandmother who is overweight or obese. And finally, as we heard yesterday from the Malaysian Minister of Health, it could be at the population level with persistent stunting and rising levels of overweight and obesity. We've heard that 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food is wasted, and that 1/3 of the greenhouse gases being emitted every year come from the food sector. In fact, if the food sector was a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet after China and the United States. And although there are 570 million smallholder farmers continuing to work across the planet, our food system increasingly looks like this: more commodified, homogenized, and globalized than ever before. And the result is that the proportion of food that we are eating from junk foods and processed foods is rising everywhere. We see here data from the UK, Canada, but also countries like Brazil and Colombia. Last century, the major public health challenges looked something like this. They were infectious diseases, they were water and sanitation challenges, they were undernutrition. And whilst many or most of those challenges still persist, the major public health challenges look increasingly more like this today. These are active vectors of disease. These have strategies, complex strategies for expanding their markets, unlike mosquitoes, and they have marketing strategies and business plans. They bring us summer, joyville, and even happiness through advertising campaigns, and they will sue governments when they try to act to protect public health. So what we're realizing is that there are some major public health challenges facing the global community today. Here are just some of them: climate change, rising social and economic inequality, overweight, obesity, but also persisting hunger, conflict, antimicrobial resistance, and even global pandemics. But what we should have realized by now is that underpinning most, if not all of these to a large degree, is in fact our food. But at the same time, food can be an opportunity to turn that on its head and in fact solve to a large degree all of these problems at once. Not just food, but our diets and of course the food system. So what do the solutions look like? Well, at the individual level, we know what diets should look like. They should be diverse, they should be rich in fruit and vegetables, whole fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts and whole grains. We should be limiting total calories from free sugars to less than 10% and preferably 5%. We should be limiting total fats to less than 30%, and we should be limiting salt to about a teaspoon. And this should all be coming from sustainable food systems. But we also know what our goals look like at the global level. We have the global nutrition targets, we have the diet-related NCD targets, and of course, we have the Sustainable Development Agenda. But time is ticking and we're not making enough progress. That is where the Decade of Action on Nutrition comes in. The United Nations Decade of Action on Nutrition was declared by the United Nations General Assembly last year in New York. That's heads of state prioritised a 10-year window to catalyse progress on committing to policy, action and impact to end all forms of malnutrition within the Sustainable Development Agenda. It focuses on 6 action areas, that is sustainable food systems for healthy diets, aligned health systems, social protection and education, of course trade and investment, we'll hear more about this in a moment, supportive environments for nutrition at all ages, including breastfeeding, and of course strengthening nutrition governance and accountability. The United Nations Decade of Action on Nutrition is about all countries. No country on the planet is immune from malnutrition. Whether that is undernutrition, wasting, stunting, micronutrient deficiency, or whether that's overweight, obesity, and diet-related NCDs, and as I mentioned, increasingly the overlap of both. It's impact-focused, it's a time-bound window within the SDG era to accelerate action to get us to 2030, where we need to be to end all forms of malnutrition, and it contributes to the great work already started by many of our sister agencies and partnerships to create one comprehensive, cohesive global movement for nutrition. A number of different initiatives are being launched under the Decade of Action, but I'm going to mention 2. The first is smart commitments. We invite all countries and all sectors to make commitments over the next decade to help us to achieve that vision of ending all forms of malnutrition. These are accountable commitments that we will be able to track and ensure are achieved. The second is action networks. These are groups of front-running countries who have shared policy interests and come together to share best practice and catalyse common efforts. Norway has already announced it will establish an action network, has already announced and established an action network on sustainable fisheries, and there are more coming soon on food labelling and also school programs. These will be tracked by not only FAO and WHO, but of course the United Nations General Assembly mechanisms as well. There's also double duty actions coined by WHO in the Global Nutrition Report. These aim to develop comprehensive approaches, not just focused on one form of malnutrition, but on dual burdens across the complete spectrum. These might include ensuring that school food programs that aim to reduce undernutrition also don't increase the risk of overweight or obesity, or that dietary guidelines reflect the current paradigm in which we live, where multiple forms are coexisting in our communities. And of course then the concept of triple burden, which includes and reflects climate change. Summing up, the SDG agenda is complex and at times seems even a little overwhelming. But the Decade of Action not only allows us a focus for driving impact on both forms, both extremes, all forms of malnutrition, but across the entire SDG agenda, because food is inextricably linked to the achievement of all SDGs and will allow us to achieve them more efficiently, more effectively, and more quickly. To finish up, food is powerful, food is emotive, food is tangible, and food is relatable. And across 7.5 billion people on the planet and 20 billion plates, even a small change in what we do or don't eat can make an enormous impact on the health of our planet and, of course, populations. So let's use the next 9 years to turn what is currently one of our biggest threats into our greatest opportunity. Thank you.